So, regarding the future of storytelling in video games, I'm going to ask an easy question for me, which is, what is the first thing that you think of if someone were to ask you about what do you think the future is of storytelling in video games?
Me.
Anyone, yes. Why not?
I remain on an eternal crusade to try and solve the 3 lines of dialogue choice outcome thing.
Right.
Basically slightly at war with BioWare, but it's not their fault. Yeah,
Yes, it is.
We've been doing a bunch of stuff to try and fix that, to think about. I mean, we and 1,000 other smarter people than us for the last 30 years have been trying to think about kind of good ways around it. But I'm really interested in kind of technology hacks around that. So we did a Sherlock Holmes game a year and a half ago now, where I just mandated in design meeting 1 that we weren't going to do that, with absolutely no idea what we were going to do instead. And we ended up doing a bunch of really dumb chatbot stuff. So we felt that it was really important that in a Sherlock Holmes game that you can do interrogations, because that's a massive part of what makes Holmes. So we wondered whether or not we could do something with scripted chatbots that felt remotely plausible. And of course they break all the time and are kind of rubbish, but then it gets interesting because then you use character to fix them. So we wrote 8 characters that had credible reasons for being really reduced conversationalists. So one was a laudanum-soaked alcoholic housewife who'd just woken up and who was rather carnally attracted to Mr. Holmes. One was an 8-year-old girl who just escaped her abductor's clutches and was in shock. One was a super suspicious Irish waiter who didn't trust the police and thought he was being asked to incriminate himself. So we kind of gave them all plausible character reasons why they would respond differently to interrogation, and then stuck a kind of game structure on top of it that required you to ask a series of good questions in a row to maximise the game outcome. And it worked like 35-40% of the time. So it was still super broken, but kind of made me excited that there is maybe scope there for something that feels that's totally fake, that isn't about AI, that isn't about trying to develop stuff that is smart enough, but is faked well enough and constrained well enough that it actually makes you feel like you're talking to people. So that's the first thing I thought of. I don't know if it's real or relevant.
Anyone has?
Sure.
Well, knowing you, the first thing I believe you would have asked is some kind of weird question. Like the future of storytelling is it in writing, in game design, or in AI? And have you heard it?
No, sorry.
Okay. Will the future of interactive storytelling be in game design, writing, or AI?
Sorry.
That's the kind of question you would have asked.
Ha!
And
Maybe.
I don't know. I really don't know. No. I think it will be all of the above. But I mistakenly raised my hand when you asked if there were writers in the audience. I'm not a writer. I'm a role-playing game writer. But writing role-playing role-playing material is totally different, because you're writing to inspire somebody. You're not writing to tell a story. So I think, well, have I told you that role-play is the answer? I think that this is the future. Not telling a story, but inspiring people to help them tell stories.
Okay. I think the mic might be deactivated, like turned off. Yeah, there's a button there.
Yeah.
And now it sounds
How's
like
that?
it's on. Yeah, I heard you fine. It doesn't bother me, but I don't know,
Are we
people
back?
like to complain. Yes, go ahead, Hal.
Is something coming through here? Closer. Okay, I'll lean. I guess that I thought you would ask, in the future, this is a setup question, I didn't think you'd actually ask it. In the future, are everybody going to tell their own stories in games? And of course, I have a contrarian answer to that,
Okay, well,
which we might get
which
into.
is?
Which is no, they're not. I think the best analogy is to look back in ancient Greece when they had festivals and everybody got up and danced. And then eventually Thespis came along and invented acting. And the people who were good at doing presentations acted, and the people who weren't became observers, became the audience. I don't see that ever being reversed.
I think in the near future, the area of gaming that doesn't have a lot of storytelling that is going to get into it in a big way is social games, particularly Facebook games. We're beginning to see that coming through at the moment. Adventureland, which is shortly to become Indiana Jones's Adventureland featuring Indiana Jones, already has traces of storytelling in it. There's unfolding plots, there's narratives in there. The CSI game, there are traces.
And it's Adventure World.
Adventure World, I'm sorry. I get Disney World, Disneyland, I get confused. There's a CSI game as well in which you're investigating cases and you do it by moving across an isometric grid looking for clues. The gameplay is rudimentary, but what keeps you coming back is the story, and this is why social games are going to adopt it, because it's going to be something that keeps people coming back to the games day after day, or encourages them to plonk down the money for some Facebook credits to get that little extra bit of plot, the next extra chapter. It's much harder to figure the metrics on the retention factor of a story and what bits of story are bringing people back to game. But as soon as someone like any of the big players realize that story is a driver in bringing players back, and indeed virality, people going, this is really good, these characters are interesting, I'm loving this story, you will never guess what happened. I think it's not far before we see something like a social soap opera game with an unfurling ongoing plot. And it'll probably be horrible, but it'll be horrible for us because it's not aimed at us. It's aimed at the Facebook players who are, I believe still the typical one is a Midwestern soccer mom grabbing 15 minutes out of her day for her little bit of R&R and escapism. And it's exactly what she wants.
And obviously, what I would imagine to happen there is that there's the content problem of constantly having to produce content and do so cheaply enough that the economics work. Does any of you see a problem for that, or is it just like an unsolvable problem?
I do see a problem like that, and I think this gives me a chance to talk about kind of the weird game landscape from a business point of view. At the moment, boxed goods still sell in America about $10 billion worth of software every year. And I think currently, if you add up all the social games, it's about $1.5 billion. Now, there's a problem here because there's a very small population of people who play that $10 billion worth of software, and there's a huge number of the people who play the social games. So, for example, I think Cityville at its height had 90 million players. And Farmville had 75, I guess, when it was at its peak. And it's really hard to imagine expanding that audience much further. If we look up the number of total people who play social games in America, it might be 120 million people, I guess, if you add them all up, because they overlap and they play simultaneously many games. And if all we can extract from a business point of view from that huge number is $1.5 billion, the future of game development is going to be kind of dismal.
This was one of the reasons why our team started Storybricks. It's the economics of telling stories in computer games are crazy. In an MMO, it's hundreds of times. You spend hundreds of man-hours for 1 hour of gameplay. We wanted to reverse that. Well, maybe not, but maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes of production for half an hour of gameplay or something like that. And yes, it is a huge problem, and it should be addressed, not only with money.
So, I mean, obviously there's some other solutions. One is to go episodic, which is what Telltale is doing, where they design the game so that you play it for 3 hours and then like the fun just drops off. They do not want you to keep playing at all, and they I think they almost actively inhibit replayability because they want you to buy the next game, of course, in a month's time. The other solution is for instance, in Echo Bazaar, is just to make the content really cheap. So, does any of you believe that's a solution that could scale to a larger part of the medium, like that could become very common?
I think really the person who should be answering this is Alexis, if he's...
Yeah, but he's on the other panel.
Oh, he's on the other. He can shout from the back of the room.
What was the question?
Scaling content cost of developing new story content versus the small number of people of social games who pay for it.
Very briefly, we have a lot on the panel, obviously need to labour. It's frugality again. So story needs to be repeatable. If you make story that's pure chain, you play through one bit, then another bit, then another bit, especially if it branches at all, if you get any kind of redundant story that's phenomenally expensive to make. If you make a story that's a Python pattern, so you repeat some of it a bit, and you see some of it more than once, that immediately becomes much more cost effective. I mean, it triples or quadruples your effective budget. But if you repeat it too many times, if you repeat it 50 or 100 times, which we do with bits of episode, it can get very grindy, then you might as well have no story, because all you've got is flavor text laid over a very simple Skinner box. So it's finding the balance in the middle between virtuous repetition and cynical repetition. That's me.
Well, yeah, and for me the actual question was, is that something that, is it something where, well, Echo Bazaar players love that, and they want to keep playing that, and Alexis is going to be able to feed his family for decades, which is great, or is it that this is something really cool, and as soon as the rest of the industry sees it and understands it, everyone's going to be doing it, which I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
I think there's going to be an attempt at escalation. That the same production cycles that we saw in box goods and in MMOs is going to happen in social games.
Right.
Very soon, things like Project Molehill and in Flash, which is the way most of these games are delivered, is going to come in, and we're going to see people competing for high-end 3D graphics in stupid Flash games. And this is going to kill the industry if we're not careful. This is a threat. So we'll see what happens. Anyway.
Okay.
I know. I mean, the one thing the game industry has never been is static. It's always change. It's always new dynamics, new platforms, new delivery systems coming through. To say that something is going to kill something, well, that's just the way the games industry works.
But I think also seeing whether or not we can fix it by faking it. My favourite long-running narrative in games ever was one that nobody wrote, which was my kind of muscle-bound cow in Animal Crossing who was in love with his next-door neighbour who was a cat called Bob. And none of that was written. It was just total coincidence of the fact that when they randomised those characters at the beginning of that game, it looked a bit like Bob was wearing a dress, even though he was called Bob. And my big cow in his muscle T-shirt would just follow him around adoringly. And with a tiny number of well-written, I mean, this is not for one moment to underestimate the quality of writing in that game, which is staggering, but with a really quite small amount of actual authored content, I got a year's heartbreaking romance and spats, and then the cow left town, which can happen in Animal Crossing.
She's the
and
ideal
left
audience.
Bob. And it still makes me sad. Poor Bob, no one ever moved in. It was too sad.
How much would you have paid to get the cow back? How many Facebook credits would you have paid?
I think today we have all learned that James Wallis is a terrible person. Well, but interestingly, I mean, and this is where this stuff is incredibly tricky. Interestingly, kind of nothing, because then it robs it of the reality of that thing having happened. But the other thing I really like about that is because it's generative and procedural, it's not spoilerable. Because the other thing that worries me about I'll be paying to find out what happens in the next instalment of Adventure World or whatever it turns out to be is, well, you're just going to tell me on Twitter for free. So how you protect plot-driven narrative when you have 100 million people playing is every day is super hard unless you make everybody have a slightly different thing. So I agree that I'm terribly gullible on this stuff, but it's interesting to look at whether or not that might save us a bit.
But that's a really interesting point, because one thing that I personally find incredibly fascinating is the slightly more involved board games and trading card games, such as Betrayal at House on the Hill, those kinds of games where you sort of create your own, cliche stereotype horror story every time, and it takes you about 2 hours, and then you play through it. And I don't think you can just go like, oh yeah, we'll put that on a computer and it'll work. But I think that's a really inspiring model for procedurally generating interesting stories.
I'm going to talk about a game changer that I see out there that no one has talked about. I think one of your slides showed the original Wolfenstein in 3D. Well, there's another one lurking out there, which will have at least a profoundest effect, I believe, as that did. And that ushered in the whole era of 3D games and the tremendous escalation of budgets we've seen. Another thing out there that coming along, and it is voice production and complete voice interface. It doesn't exist yet, but of course we all experience when we go online or get on the phone and try to interact with some company and there's a nice robot. When those first started happening, they were absolutely terrible. Now they're using snippet voice stuff so that they sound like humans, and in a small domain they're able to have a conversation with you. This is going to really get going. It's probably going to require huge amounts of computation to do it. So we'll all be escalating the size of our hard drives, and there'll be sound processors, and there's all sorts of stuff that need to come along. But eventually, this is going to have a profound change in what we're going to do. We don't have to worry about those 3 lines of dialogue anymore. You'll just talk to people, and they will talk back. And it'll still be, in some sense, canned. You'll still be writing the words somehow, but possibly you'll just be writing the thoughts in an expert system database. When this happens, it's going to change our relationship to our computers in every way you can imagine. First of all, it's going to really open up the dramatic possibilities for storytelling and games. But think of lonely old ladies who the pet just died, and the new pets are going to be computers, and that they're going to be their companions. Me too, when I just get a few more years than me.
I agree with the future of relationship with digital characters and that are procedurally driven, but I disagree totally about voice. I think it would be about animation, because you can already do that with your Sims, and if your Sims could express a bit more, and they could be part of a story instead of being part of an iterative process.
I think it is about voice. I don't think it's about the characters talking to us. I think it's about us talking to the characters, or people talking to the characters. If you are a bit lonely, particularly if you're of an older generation, being able to just, instead of having to type commands or type words into a screen, just being able to speak. And I don't think the technology is that far away. I think everyone in the room who's got a smartphone, it's got voice dialing in there. I have a word processor that comes with voice transcription built in. I once paid £200 for software to do that, and it wasn't very good. Now it came free with a £15 word processor. It's not brilliant, but it's good enough, particularly if it's looking for keywords. This is in a word processor. It's looking for any word I could possibly say. If it's programmed to look specifically for keywords, that's a much simpler piece of technology and a much lower processing load. I think that's eminently doable, and I think it's very close.
All right.
Can't wait.
Well, sorry.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
I think, can I just plead a little bit that at least for a while, with all of, or any of those things, we don't do it with things that are trying to look like people. Like, please, let's just not make it as possibly hard for us as it could conceivably be. One of the reasons the Animal Crossing thing, one of the reasons that works is a cat and a dress. One of the reasons that the pet thing will work is it's a pet. One of the reasons the Sims work is that they're not too real, and the more you dial that fidelity up, the scarier all of this gets. So, yeah, more cats and dresses.
You talked about Scott McCloud. No, Alexis did.
No, I think I did.
Oh, you did. And I had a Scott McCloud slide. Somebody asked, and it's right. He wrote about it. The more iconic you are, the more people relate to what you are. You saw very little of our game, but we we use iconic characters because of that.
Yeah, this is Scott McCloud's Triangle.
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why I actually like casual games. I like Facebook games, or at least some aspects of them, and I'm kind of scared of the 3D and Flash becoming possible, because we'll probably get the same sort of arms race that we had in non-Flash games, and it just takes up an enormous amount of resources, and also it paints us into a corner, I think.
I recently replayed a game that I did. I showed you a still from it, the Indiana Jones Infernal Machine game. And I couldn't play it for years, but it's 12 years old now. And instead of being embarrassing, the meager number of polygons we could push around on that screen now just looked retro to me. So I kind of enjoyed it again. And what amazed me was that, gee, the levels are fantastic, and there's so many of them, and they're so big and complicated and wonderful. And so I got in contact with my old level designers, and I sort of wrote them a long overdue second congratulations. And one of the guys is still at LucasArts, a guy named Steve Chen, and he wrote back kind of a sad note, which is that they can't do anything like that anymore at LucasArts. It's about 10% of the gameplay we did, because the cost of the assets is escalated so hugely.
To come back to dialogue a little bit, I mean, we've talked about voice recognition, text-to-speech, but I've always also been frustrated with dialogue interfaces, and I'm wondering whether, are we ever going to get away from those I can choose from 3 lines, or is that an interface problem, or is this the whole paradigm that's beneath it that's wrong and needs to go somewhere else?
But we don't mind the regular human interface of just chatting with each other. And if we put that in a game, I think we'll be okay.
Sure, but apart from that. Well, even then, I wonder if, with user interface design, often if it's nice to be able to go like, do this, and there's no ambiguity in when you talk to a computer. Whereas if you talk to a person, that often doesn't work well, I found.
Well, there's only no ambiguity if it was clear what the thing that you were selecting was actually going to accomplish, and sometimes it's meant to be and isn't, and sometimes it isn't meant to be and isn't. I think what's weird, I'm just struck thinking about this, is because I've certainly never been able to come up with a way to solve that interface, but whether you're doing it with wheels or menus or context points or whatever, doesn't really change the fundamental thing. What's interesting to me is that the idea of speaking to directly with my voice is crazy retro weird. That's not how I talk to people. I talk to people like this. and that is true. Most of my conversations with my friends are typed. And I think that's true now for a whole generation. And I agree that it is generational, and that stuff is shifting.
Wait a minute.
But
there's always Skype.
I type in Skype. I mean, and we default often now to meet to when we're Skyping for work, we do it in text, because it's a fatter information stream. More of you can talk at once productively in text than in voice. So, although I am horrified to hear myself advocating this, it's interesting that actually, and the benefit of when you're talking in type is that you semaphore nuance more computably. That when I'm talking, you're hugely dependent on what I'm doing with my hands and what I'm doing with my tone of voice and my eyebrows and all the rest of it. In text, I'm probably giving you some smileys or some asterisks or something. So I think actually the idea that we're really, really close to a very naturalistic, for many people, way of talking, but that is type, is kind of super plausible to me.
I feel weird talking about story bricks all the time, but it's my future of video games. So since the theme of the panel.
And a word from our sponsor.
Yes. So I won't.
No, please.
Okay, I talk a little bit how we intend on doing that, which is basically no dialogue, but you directly convey the intention. I want to frighten you. I want to, and you don't need words. You only need words for the character to respond. But if the intention is clear, it's much better than choosing between lines that you must interpret yourself. And I was really pleased seeing that Captain Blood it will be reissued. Well, there is a new version coming out, which was basically an iconic language for talking to aliens. And it's, well, I mean, it's been 20 years, and nobody has done that since, and it was awesome.
That's something that I find fascinating, is that in the 80s and early 90s, people were doing really crazy things, and probably because back then you could do it really cheaply. And then things got more professional and more expensive, and people sort of settled on a couple of solutions that worked. And what I find interesting about sort of the indie and online distribution movements, if I guess I'll have to call it that, but it's, especially indie games and the fact that the barriers to entry are very low, and you can distribute the games and you can make little art games, is that would give the possibility to try out new things and just go like, no, I don't want to do what everyone else has been doing, and I can try things out very cheaply. But I'm not seeing that many things in terms of interpersonal communication, like dialogue, or storytelling for that matter.
Well, did we start the day by having the fight about defining story? I think from my
you weren't there.
from my super limited experience in the dialogue stuff, and I defer entirely to you guys because this is not so much my thing. It's just a big, hard problem. Like, even if the production values of the platform that you're developing for is an indie are quite low, if you're one guy on your own trying to figure out a new way of doing this stuff, it's just huge. Language is a bitch. Language is hard. Sure. So kind of that problem just doesn't ever get any smaller. But I think the different kinds of storytelling, absolutely. I mean, I think I've been having conversations today about Jason Rohrer's work. Those are stories, they're not narrative, they're very much built around a tiny production cost, but I think are still really rich. So I think we're doing it in story. I think the problem in language parsing just remains hard.
Please, got a question?
Well, it's not a question. I just wanted to add, somebody earlier talked about how controllers and Connect and everything.
Richard, yeah.
We're working on a Connect idea. We don't know if we're actually going to do it, which because we are so expressive with our hands and everything, and we're talking about icons, that telling the Connect what this means and what this means, and what this means and what this means, is a way to get some of those icons without worrying about any words or graphics or anything else.
Okay.
Well, in the long run, language is going to triumph because that's what we all use. That's our defining characteristic as human beings, and we love to talk and we love to hear what other people have to say. So I have to think that as time goes on, that's going to still be a dominant factor. I think the reason why we've had very artificial interfaces for dialogue in most games till now is because the dialogue has been seen as a form of puzzle. Dialogue is usually dealt with in games, story games, as either a complicated maze or literally some sort of peculiar puzzle where you have to do persuasion and so forth and try to suss out what you're supposed to say. And that's why the choices are there. But there are other ways to handle dialogue. And it's also possible to make those choices less visible and more audible. So.
My least favorite, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'd like to hear more about that. Can you give examples?
What part of it?
Different ways of handling.
Well, one of the ways is to get rid of dialogue as a set of puzzles and just have it be some sort of information. So people will say things, but you don't let that rise to the level of puzzling. You don't let that rise to a challenge in the game. Instead, it becomes part of the decoration of a game in the same way that other production values. It's valuable and it's important because we live in a world of language, but you don't have to actually make that a part of the mechanic. So that's one way to do it, and that's done very often in console games, and especially the older ones where the dialogue was in print. But it's still done a lot, where you will hear conversations and you might participate in some vague way, but you don't actually solve a lot of problems that way. Another way to do it, and something I've done, I wish the game had turned out better, but we use a token system. I did a game for DTP a couple years ago, where we decided that we would still keep the puzzling idea, but we would reduce it away from actual dialogue choices. So the puzzles became, these things you collected. You could collect ideas, and as well as objects. And the idea behind that is don't treat them any differently. And so you need a key for a box, but you need a certain phrase, or you need some idea to try on somebody to get someone to help you. And that gets rid of that multiple choice thing, which I hate as much as you do. So I think those are all plausible. But I think that just think of a more gamey version of calling up the airlines and trying to get a flight, and suddenly it gets interesting.
James, you mentioned the status. Was it?
Yes, the Keith Johnston's status stuff and body language and things like that, and emotions. I mean, we're talking about dialogue. We're not talking about dialogue plus emotion. What about a thing where the solution to a problem is to get angry? I mean, that's something that one could do with a microphone, but very, very hard to do in any form of text to make the computer understand, unless. Oh no, there was Scott Adams' incredible Hulk adventure, which yes, someone remembers it, 1982, I think. It was his first licensed Marvel Comics game, and you start the game tied hand and foot to a chair, and the only way to get out of that chair is to type bite lip, which makes you angry, and then you Hulk out and you break your back. It's one of the most horrible. I apologize for bringing up the subject of getting angry in games.
Great reference.
Yeah, but the status thing, it might be interesting. What if you did a game with a dialogue system where it's not about, trying to convince someone or finding out some information, but it's about manipulating status. So actually the content of the dialogue might not be very interesting, but then the whole conversation itself becomes about something completely different. That might be...
Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as using keywords, or if we're talking about voice pauses, listening for the way you're talking. Are you talking in a dominant way? Where are you saying what kind of are you saying in the sentence? Are you sounding low status or are you sounding high status?
Which sounds a huge leap up, but I think still leaves us with your point, which is if this is just puzzle unpicking, that's a much more naturalistic way to do it, but it's still just puzzle unpicking. And balancing this problem of the minute you give me my own voice, whether I'm typing or talking or whatever, and this is at the heart of a lot of what we've been talking about today, you're asking me what I think and what I want to express. And building a mechanical system that is going to be meaningfully responsive to that is terrifyingly hard.
And also a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, do not want that from a game. They do not want the game to challenge them in that way. They want to be given a linear narrative and a fixed set of options, most of which are actually going to be correct. That people don't enjoy failing in games particularly. I think it's one of the reasons that Facebook games have been so successful. There are no fail states in most Facebook games. You can only succeed slightly less well. People want linearity, they want simple choices, they don't want, I think it's one of the reasons the old text adventures died and the point and clicks, the puzzles were too hard for the mass market. It's not what people want to do to relax.
I think the problem is hard. It's a famously deep AI problem, but it's starting to be solved. And I guess the poster child is Watson, the IBM machine that beat the guys in Jeopardy, and is now being used, it's going to be used in hospitals as a diagnostic helper. It's kind of an expert system. It's not real AI in the sense that it's an actual intelligence that's learning, but it sort of does, and it is able to parse human questions successfully most of the time. It's unbelievably better than humans. When we invented flying, we didn't flap our wings and put feathers on like birds do. We did use another method, aluminum and engines. And I think that's going to be how we will eventually realize this. But for most people, it's going to seem to pass the Turing test, and it's going to seem like dialogue. And I think once we can start to have conversations, suddenly human interactivity just becomes an order of magnitude more interesting. And suddenly maybe we aren't going to want to just shoot people in the head 19 times for an achievement.
Although so Watson is fascinating. Cleverbot is fascinating. I don't know if there are any Cleverbot fans. So Cleverbot is completely fake. Yes. Cleverbot has no AI. It just records what people have typed into it and parrots it back and looks for patterns. And Cleverbot is funny because it's us and we're funny. And Cleverbot seems to prank you and seems to be hostile to you and seems to be flirting with you and seems to be making fun of you. And there's no AI there. Well, there is some AI there. There's some. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of clever stuff going on, but it's not trying to do exactly that. But the Watson thing is really interesting because it's clearly hugely powerful, but it's not a conversation. It's that diagnostic thing is.
It could be.
Well, we are clearly much closer to it than we were, and there's no surer way to make yourself look like an idiot than prophesying that this stuff is never going to happen when we've consistently figured all of this stuff out from here on in. I'm interested in whether or not that's where we want to go and whether or not that's the quickest way to get there. And I think the fakery stuff is really interesting. I think Cleverbot is really interesting in terms of where that takes us.
I'd like to react to what you were talking about with the puzzle trap. I think that one way out of this puzzle trap is to teach the player that his character's failures are not necessarily his failures. We don't have to equate the two. Because if we look at any kind of story, it's more interesting if the protagonist fails before succeeding. And it doesn't have to mean that the player has failed. We have to find intelligent ways in which we can do that. But for instance, if you lose a fight and you're beaten up and you end up in an hospital and you meet the nice nurse, it's not a failure state, it's just another story. And when we have that, we don't have to solve conversation, we don't have to solve interaction, we just have to play them and see where they lead.
All right, final question. Which sort of area of the medium, of which, is it, let's say, maybe social games or maybe not social games, or indie games, or whatever you can think of, do you find the most promising regarding storytelling? Like the area where this is where the really exciting things are happening? If I could have an answer from each of you.
I bet we've all got the same slightly cop-out answer, which is, I think, interesting things are going to come out of all of those. I think, I think there's clearly really radically interesting stuff happening with the flourishing indie scene. I think where social games take story is going to be interesting. I think how we deal with the ever-escalating challenges of trying to tell stories in AAA environments is super interesting. I think also anything we can do to not perpetuate those silos is great. I think there's a bunch of indie game makers making monetized games on Facebook, and good luck to them. There's got to be a lot of good stuff there. I think there's a whole bunch of people who are making amazing indie things in their spare time whose day job is working at EA or THQ or whatever. I think it doesn't help us to set up those barriers.
I think there's going to be kind of a bifurcation. I think that we're going to. I think social games are the games du jour, and I think it's going to continue for a while. There's an arc going on there. Whether this is a slightly long, extended fad, or whether it's going to be a permanent addition, I don't know. But I just think this whole idea of a kind of a loose way of gathering people together in a game, which is less restrictive than an MMO, is really powerful. And the free marketing you get with all your friends telling everybody else is also pretty powerful. So I think that's going to continue for a while. But what I'm very interested in the way in which those of us who are not using big budgets have learned to try to strive to make the low end work in a way that is escalation proof. And Alexis was talking about this. Echo Bazaar is a good example of this, where it's a visual game, but the visuals are limited to kind of icons. And the game that I was working on, Thorn, is a game like that, where it's visual but not pictorial, and it's deliberately designed to make a presentation that's successful without having to resort to the complicated assets that a pictorial game would have. And I think there's a lot more invention that's going to happen at the low end like that, and maintain the indie thrust.
I'm keeping an eye out at the low end of the indie market, the one-person, the two-person teams, and the art game. I'm not going to say market because most of them are free, and a lot of them make my teeth hurt. They're painfully earnest, they don't work. But the ones that are good, they don't necessarily have great storytelling. Some of them only have very basic storytelling. Some of them do have systems of storytelling that we've simply not seen before, very simple little stories. But they're games that aren't afraid to be about something. They've got themes. They've got a substance there. And that, I think, is a step towards proper story games that, again, aren't afraid to be about and tackle big themes. And when I say big themes, I don't mean child abuse. I mean, loss and grief and happiness and love and things like that. And to do it in a way that doesn't feel cloying and that isn't conflated with hundreds of lines of badly written dialogue by some underpaid hack. I think if we can work it out in simple forms, we can expand that into all areas of what we do.
I would look at procedural content generation. I was quite impressed. I'm still impressed by the work of the guy who is making Love. Yes, is one guy and is making an MMO by himself because he makes procedural content. And he was talking at the Game AI conference, very good one, about stories in generated procedurally. And basically, these are not very interesting stories. It talks about having a big MacGuffin in his world. But the interesting thing is, since you describe these story element in terms of game content, every character in the game can refer to them, talk about how they influence their lives and behaviors. So it doesn't have to be deep if the effects are felt everywhere. His example was in Star Wars, everybody talks about the Death Star, and MacGuffin should be as big as that.
All right, thank you very much. And please give a warm round of applause. We'll go to the next panel.